Thank you all for coming, and thanks to the organizers and to my hosts for making this talk possible. I'm very excited to be here. Today I'll be talking about one of my main research areas of interest, and that's in the long-run effects of early life health shocks, and in particular, the role of policy interventions and whether they can help those who are hit by negative shocks early in life. So I just want to start out by breaking down exactly what I mean when I say early life health shock. So first of all, what is early life? Economists tend to just use this as kind of a broad term to describe the first few years of life, including the in utero period. And you may have seen this phrase, first 1,000 days, kind of thrown out in the media, and this roughly corresponds to the 9 months in utero plus the first 2 years out of the womb. And you'll see it a lot actually in examples such as this one, where in this UNICEF article here talking about the first 1,000 days of life, as well as in this US nonprofit that has actually adopted that phrase 1,000 days as its name, and where their goal is to improve nutrition and ensure women and children have the healthiest first 1,000 days. Now, when I say health shock, what exactly do I mean by that? I'm going to start off by showing you some pictures of examples. And while these figures here might have actually not been too problematic in the 1950s, say, anyone who sees this now will think, uh-oh, that can't be good, because we've learned a lot about what smoking during pregnancy, drinking during pregnancy can do to the fetus. And so therefore, this is an important early life health shock that we know has long-run negative consequences for the unborn baby. Now, this next picture, I think, deviates a little bit from what we usually think of when we think health shock. This is a picture of a generic drought that has caused a harvest to fail. And the reason, so why do I consider this an early life health shock? Well, if this occurs during a child's, early life, kind of a vulnerable and critical period in their life, the loss of income and the malnutrition and the disease that could result from this type of income shock we now know can actually have quite lasting implications for the children that are affected. Now, this last picture that I'm going to show you here is just a picture of pollution being emitted from coal power plants, and I've just put this up here to emphasize that pollution is yet another important early life health shock of growing importance, I would say, that I'm particularly interested in, have done some work on as well. And this is something that can affect a mother who is pregnant, as well as an infant or a child that's very young. Now, stepping away from these examples for a second, I just want to lay out exactly what I mean. So when I say health shock, I really mean anything that can affect the health of an infant or a child. And it's useful when we think about these to recognize that the health of an infant or a child is determined in part by how healthy that child was as a fetus, and also how healthy that child's mother was during pregnancy. And so the examples that I showed you earlier can be thought of as affecting one of these three bubbles. So alcohol and smoking during pregnancy affects maternal health. Pollution exposure, depending on who is the one breathing it in, can affect maternal health and child health directly. And these droughts and these other income shocks that I described can affect maternal health as well as the health of an infant, and primarily through those channels that I mentioned, disease and malnutrition. Now, so when we think about things actually in this framework, I think it becomes less surprising to see in the economic literature the huge range of studies and the huge range of the types of shocks that have been studied in this, what I often call the early life literature. So papers have looked at droughts and other weather shocks, pollution exposure, disease epidemics, and these are all negative shocks, and that's actually going to be the focus of my paper, but there have also been papers about positive early life shocks, and these are things like disease eradication programs and nutrient supplementation programs, for example. Now that we're kind of hopefully on the same page about what I mean when I say early life health shocks, where I'm going to go from here is to just to give an overview of the literature on the importance of the early life environment, and then to talk a little bit about policy interventions and catch-up. And I'm going to describe exactly what I mean by catch-up in a few minutes. And in particular, I'm going to just first ask how can we actually study this idea of catch-up, and then I'll be going to be going over some recent academic research on this topic, including some of my own work. Now, the academic economist interest, I'd say, in this early life work has stemmed from what's known as the fetal origins hypothesis. And this is, very broadly speaking, it's simply the hypothesis that conditions during your fetal period have persistent effects on an individual's health. And this was actually first popularized by a British physician, Dr. Barker, in the early 1990s. And although I will say that medical and epidemiological research on this topic actually dates back quite a bit further than that, to the 1960s, in particular when there were studies about that were first linking birth defects to things that happen in utero, as well as a separate set of studies looking at the Dutch famine and linking famine exposure in utero to long-run health outcomes, and basically finding that individuals who were exposed to the famine in utero saw negative health outcomes when they were in adolescence and adulthood. Now, the economic interest in this topic, I'd say, kind of really blew up in the early 2000s, and now it's still a growing literature, but it's already quite a mature and large literature at the moment. I would say that there were two main contributions from economists, and that was first to look at non-health outcomes. So to ask, instead of how did these health shocks lead to, persist in terms of their later life health, how did these early life health shocks affect educational attainment, income, labor market outcomes, and so on. And the second was to really focus on trying to identify causality instead of just correlations. And I'll put this last point up on the slide, but I won't talk too much about it now, although I'll be happy to take questions in Q&A. Economists have also really thought carefully about these concepts of selective mortality as well as parental investment responses. So what has this huge explosion in the literature brought us? Well, what have we learned? So just going back to this list of the various types of shocks, which, by the way, this is not at all an exhaustive list of the types of shocks or of the citations for each topic. This is just to give you a flavor of what's out there. We have found that droughts and other types of weather shocks that lead to lower income, these have been found to have reduced educational attainment, self-reported health, and assets in adulthood. So these are for individuals that were exposed early in life. Pollution exposure, either in utero or in the first year of life, we now know can increase infant mortality. It can reduce your test scores when you're in high school, and it can also affect income in adulthood. Now, disease epidemics, in particular, this paper looks at the Spanish flu epidemic in the US and finds that this, exposure to this epidemic in utero, once again, led to lower educational attainment, higher rates of physical disability, and lower socioeconomic status in adulthood. So those were kind of the negative shocks. And also, on the positive side of things, we see that disease eradication programs, in particular, disease eradication programs aimed at malaria and hookworm, for example, these have improved school attendance in childhood as well as income in adulthood. And finally, nutrient supplementation programs, those involving iodine supplementation, for example, these have also been found to have improved school attendance in childhood, cognitive ability, and educational attainment in adulthood. So these are very long and persistent effects that we're talking about. And so the bottom line, what is this literature telling us? They're telling us that early life circumstances matter quite a bit, which is an important finding, but also I think a little bit of a worrisome finding when you think about children in developing countries that are hit by these negative shocks, they have a much larger propensity to be hit by these negative shocks, I should say. And so my next question is then, what can we do about it, right? Can policy interventions, and when I say policy interventions, I mean things like conditional cash transfer programs, nutrient supplementation programs, preschool programs, remedial education, that sort of thing, can these policy interventions help generate catch-up for the children who are hit by these negative shocks early on? And if so, what types of interventions can help us do this? And I want to be clear here about what I mean when I say catch-up. So an intervention has the potential to generate catch-up if it helps disadvantaged children. So I'm going to use the phrase disadvantaged children to refer to those who were hit by a negative early life shock. So if it helps disadvantaged children more than the less disadvantaged counterparts. So I want to be clear that this is a distinct characteristic from overall effectiveness. A program can be extremely effective. It can improve outcomes for children across the board, but it's not going to generate catch-up if it helps everyone equally or if it helps the more advantaged children more than the disadvantaged children. And so how can we actually identify whether a policy intervention is successful in generating catch-up? It seems somewhat easy, right? We just want to ask, does an intervention have larger effects on a disadvantaged group? So again, those hit by a negative shock. And so if we think of a group, 4 different groups of people, group A was disadvantaged, hit by a shock, and was also exposed to intervention. Group B was not disadvantaged, also exposed to an intervention. Group C, no intervention, disadvantaged. Group D, no intervention, not disadvantaged. So to get the effect of the intervention, to estimate the effect of the intervention on a disadvantaged group, we might take A minus C. To get that same effect of the intervention for those who are not disadvantaged, we'd take B minus D. And then if we want to answer this question that I have up on the slide, we might just compare A minus C and B minus D. That would be the simple way to do things. The problem with this, the first problem, is that children who receive an intervention, so that's kids who are, so A and B, kids who receive an intervention are usually quite different from children who don't receive an intervention. And that could be because the government targets a certain population. It could be because parents who take advantage of interventions are very different from the parents who don't even know about such interventions. And so what does that mean for us? That means that this A minus C, B minus D, that might not really capture the effect of an intervention. It might just capture these other differences that I mentioned earlier. And similarly, then the second problem is that disadvantaged children, so groups A and C, are also different, kind of for the same reasons, from not disadvantaged children, B and D, for lots of other reasons, right? So if you're hit by a negative shock, your parents probably have different characteristics, you probably live in different environments, and these types of differences might be the reason for any differences we find in these two terms. And that's crucial. And that makes it very difficult for us to really identify whether an intervention has generated catch-up. So what we need then is we need random variation across both dimensions. So what do I mean by this? Ideally, we want some sort of experiment that determines which children actually get an intervention, and we want some sort of experiment that determines which children experience an early life shock. And that generally doesn't happen very often, but we're going to be using a strategy like this, and that's what we use in actually a recent working paper that I have with some of my co-authors. The draft should be on my website if you want to take a look, but it's basically about helping children catch up. That's the first phrase of the title. And what are we doing here? We are asking whether a conditional cash transfer program in Mexico during childhood, so this is something that children are exposed to during childhood, whether that can help alleviate early life disadvantage, and when I say early life, I mean generated the year you were born. And so what we're going to be using to analyze this question is we're going to be investigating a CCT program, Mexico's PROGRESA, which was crucially for us implemented using an experimental design. And as a determinant of early life health, we're going to be using rainfall shocks in the year of birth. And we're using these kind of as a natural experiment. These rainfall shocks we show affect income and will also show affect health, and will later show affect educational attainment. So these rainfall shocks we use as kind of our shock to the early life health. And this we consider a natural experiment because they're essentially random. I'm running low on time, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the program, but I will say a few important things about it. The program was a CCT program, so it gave money to mothers if their children attended school. There was also a health component, but that's not the focus of our paper. And again, as I've mentioned already, for evaluation programs, the program was rolled out experimentally, so that gives us random variation. And here are our main results, really in graphical form. We've done a lot of more sophisticated analysis and robustness checks and so on, but really, when it comes down to it, we can actually show our results in a simple figure like this, where I'm just plotting here the educational attainment for 4 different groups of people, those who were hit by a rainfall shock, those who were not hit by a rainfall shock, and those who were exposed to, who did not receive the PROGRESA program, and those who did receive the PROGRESA program. A few things to note about this figure. These bars are higher than these bars. So PROGRESA helped children achieve more education. The other thing to note, the gray bars are higher than the blue bars. So as I mentioned earlier, really these rainfall shocks that we're talking about actually did have meaningful implications later in life. Those who were hit by the shock had lower educational attainment than those that didn't. But the most crucial part of our findings is the fact that the gap between these two bars is a lot bigger than the gap between these two bars. What does that mean? That means that PROGRESA increased educational attainment more for the disadvantaged children, right? And so just to reiterate what I just said, the children who were randomly exposed to a negative rainfall shock in the first year of life, they did worse later in life in terms of educational attainment and also employment outcomes, which I didn't show you on the previous slide. But they benefited more from this experimentally assigned PROGRESA program than those who did not experience the negative rainfall shock. So in other words, PROGRESA was able to generate catch-up in this context. Now there have been a number kind of around the same time, so these are actually, what I'm going to be talking about now are all very recent working papers. So there have been a number of other studies trying to utilize the same two-shock strategy and have found similar results. So a paper in Bangladesh looks at a cyclone and a randomized vitamin supplementation program. Another paper looks at nurse home visitation in infancy and high-quality preschool in Denmark. And a third paper looks at access to abortion kind of as the early life shock and better quality high school as the later life intervention. And all of them, in addition to using the same similar strategies, all of them actually find some evidence of remediation. And I wrote some in parentheses because these first two really do find strong evidence of remediation, and the evidence is a little bit weaker in this third paper. And so in summary, the early life environment is crucial and has persistent effects. And like I said, this is somewhat worrisome for children who are disadvantaged early on, especially those in developing countries. But fortunately, we do have evidence of some interventions that can help alleviate this early life disadvantage. So it can help those who are hit by shocks more than it helps those who are not hit by these same shocks. So these are the types of programs that have been studied. But clearly, I just want to finish by emphasizing that this is clearly a context-specific question, and it's hard to generalize to all sorts of interventions and all sorts of shocks. But to a certain extent, I think the finding about conditional cash transfer programs and rainfall is somewhat generalizable because rainfall shocks are very common in the developing world, and conditional cash transfer programs are becoming also a lot more common in terms of as a policy tool for developing countries. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take questions if anyone has any. Well, I think I've been learning a lot about what the ADB does in the past couple of days, but it sounds like there is some interest here, the ADB is interested in education and is interested in things like conditional cash transfer programs, and it might be of interest then for people for policymakers that want to implement things like these conditional cash transfer programs to think about targeting perhaps towards children who might need this extra push because they were exposed to shocks early in life, for example. So that might be another angle to consider when implementing something like this. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a good question, and this is something that comes up a lot, and I think it's important that I clarify. So for the sample that we're looking at, PROGRESA really only affected their educational outcomes. So we're looking at children that were aged 12 to 18 in 2003, so they were around 6-ish six or older when the program first came in. And most of the findings related to the health aspects of PROGRESA, most of those effects were really focused on much younger children. So for the children that we're looking at, the main effect of PROGRESA was to change their educational attainment. It had very little effect on their health, or so the previous literature finds. So, and we link these children to rainfall shocks so their rainfall shocks they experienced were in the first 1,000 days. So it was their first year of life. So we're looking at a shock very early on and this educational intervention over a decade later. Many years, right. Yeah.
But can you somehow disentangle impact of condition versus cash?
No. We've tried and we've thought about it, but I don't think there's a good way, given that receiving the cash is endogenous. So we've tried, and there are some aspects that we've thought about. For example, there's some variation in terms of household composition that results in differences in the cash amount, but those differences are also somewhat endogenous because it depends on fertility and things like that. But that's, I think, a huge question that we do want to answer at some point.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. The first is, you said there was a distinction between whether a program helps in catch-up versus general effectiveness. I guess the question is, to the extent that a program like PROGRESA wasn't really designed to catch up, I mean, so what then do you conclude for, I mean, so how important is it to focus on one versus the other, given, and in some ways, is it, shouldn't one focus more on programs that are specifically designed to address the catch-up issue versus something like this, which I think is just meant to help the population more generally?
Right. So I think the reason we studied this was because of the experimental variation that it gave us, right? And so, and you're right, that this program was not, I mean, in a sense, they wanted to help poor people, so they targeted poor households. So in the sense, they were trying to help a targeted population, but they weren't thinking, we want to help children that were experienced a negative rainfall shock early on. So I view this analysis as kind of taking advantage of things that had already happened to see whether it's even possible for something like this to help generate catch-up. And I think now that we know this, then this provides us with, I guess, another tool or another way to think about these tools that we have from a policymaker's perspective, another way to think about what kinds of effects these types of policies can have.
And just the second question is, in terms of design of, let's say, ADB projects, or any suggestions for how we might do it so that the kinds of causal identification that you have can be more easily done?
Oh, well, I mean, obviously, RCTs are fantastic when you can run an experiment. That they're fantastic for evaluation, but also any sort of, there are always budgets, I think, limited budgets involved in these types of things, so you often can't roll everything out at the same time. Staggered rollouts can also help with causal identification, I think, as long as it's not done in as long as it's done somewhat randomly to a certain extent. And so I think those end up being really useful for research purposes.
Make is when collecting data of treatment versus control, you need information, retrospective information 10 years ago, right? So first 1,000 days. So I think questionnaire, having some special module, asking about health condition and also village, rainfall, etc., mothers, condition, etc., can be helpful.
Definitely,
I think,
definitely. I think,
so having that module is quite important to make this project feasible for any ADB project. I think.
That's very true, and I'd like to reiterate that it doesn't even have to be that much detail. Simply a specific place of birth or a specific place of anything where at any age helps a lot in terms of analysis later on. Because once you have place of birth, you can link that to a lot of other data sets that give you information about that place of birth. But obviously, more information about conditions at the time of birth are always helpful as well. Yeah.
I'm just curious about how the money transferred to those poor families are spent. So there's no controversy on the cash transfer is effective, and then now your results show, okay, the poor families receive the cash, then the school attendance increased, but then people do not consume money, and then they purchase something. So what kind of things affects those poor families, how the money is spent, and then if we understand how the resources spent on catching up those things, then maybe the government can specifying what kind of specific interventions can help those people who get face negative shock. So I'm curious, do you have any sense how those resources spent and how the government can identify the policy to intervene to catch up?
So I actually don't know off the top of there. I know there are studies out there that look at expenditures and consumption, and obviously they find that they increase as a result of PROGRESA. I don't know. I think there are some increases in assets and investments and that sort of thing, but I don't know anything more specific than that. But I will say that we actually have a more sophisticated model in this paper trying to actually get at the question of why is this generating remediation, and actually kind of separately from the issue that you raised, we find that this type of catch-up actually comes out of, it's actually an optimal response of parents because of the fact that lower endowment, so children who are hit by a negative shock, their the incentive, the PROGRESA incentive in terms of lifetime income and in terms of future wages that they're going to earn is just a larger incentive in terms of the decision making. And so one reason why this intervention is generating catch-up just has to do with parents optimally responding to different types of children. But what you mentioned about how they're spending their money, that's a completely separate issue that's probably important as well, but we can't say too much about that at this point.